Sunday was the one day the whole week finally slowed down. The kitchen filled up early, before anyone even had their shoes on, and whatever little the family had was made to stretch into something that felt like plenty. These are the quiet Sunday foods that held families together when there was almost nothing left to hold on to. Long before the church bells rang, somebody in the house was already up putting the beans on. A bag of dry pintos cost almost nothing, and that was the whole point of it. Grandmother would pour them into a heavy pot the night before and cover them with water so they could swell up soft and ready by morning. On Sunday she dropped in a small ham hock, the kind the butcher nearly gave away, and let the whole thing sit low on the back of the stove while everyone went off to the service. By the time they came home, the house smelled like smoke and salt and something warm waiting for them. The beans had gone thick and creamy, and that single bone had flavored a pot big enough to feed every mouth at the table twice over. Nobody ever called it poor. They just called it Sunday. And the leftovers, ladled over bread, would quietly carry the family halfway through the week before anyone admitted the meat was long gone. In a lot of homes, Sunday supper was nothing more than cornbread and buttermilk, and the children waited for it all day long. The cornbread was baked that morning in a black iron skillet that had been in the family longer than anyone could remember. It was greased with a little bacon fat, poured in, and set in the oven, until the edges went gold and crisp around the rim. When evening came and the big midday meal was only a memory, somebody would crumble a thick piece of that cornbread into a tall glass and pour cold buttermilk over the top of it. You ate it with a spoon, slow, sitting on the porch steps as the last of the light went down. It cost only pennies, and it filled you up just the same. For grandparents who grew up with almost nothing, that simple glass of cornbread and milk was the taste of a quiet Sunday evening, of being fed and safe, even when the cupboard was nearly bare. When a family was lucky enough to keep a few chickens out back, Sunday was the day one of the old hens finally went into the pot. These were not young, tender birds at all. They were layers that had stopped laying, tough and stringy, and the only way to make them good was to simmer them low for hours until the meat fell away soft from the bone. While the broth bubbled, grandmother rolled out a simple dough of flour, a little fat and water, and cut it into rough strips with a knife. She dropped them in one at a time, and they swelled up thick and pillowy and soaked up all that golden broth. The dumplings were really the whole trick of it. They turned one skinny old bird into a pot that could feed 8 or 9 people and still leave them full. The children always fought over the dumplings and never the meat, and there was usually just enough broth left over to warm up plain on Monday and call it a meal. On the Sundays when there was no meat in the house at all, there was still gravy, and somehow that was enough to get by on. They called it different names in different places, but it was really just flour browned in a little grease, then loosened with milk and stirred until it went thick and smooth. A few twists of black pepper, a good pinch of salt, and that was the whole of it. Grandmother poured it steaming over biscuits she had cut out that morning with the rim of a drinking glass, since there was no fancy cutter anywhere in the house. The biscuits soaked it up and turned soft in the middle. It seems like almost nothing now, plain white gravy and bread, but it sat warm and heavy in a child's stomach and carried them through a long afternoon. When the meat ran out, this was how a Sunday table still felt full, and nobody who sat at it ever went to bed hungry. In late summer, when the garden gave more tomatoes than the family could ever eat fresh, Sunday breakfast often turned into tomato gravy. Grandmother put up jars of tomatoes all through the hot months, and on a lean morning she would open one and pour it into a skillet with a spoonful of grease and a little flour to thicken it. It cooked down sweet and tangy and deep red, and she ladled it over biscuits the same way she did the milk gravy. It cost nothing but a single jar she had filled with her own 2 hands. For a lot of families, this was the taste of making it through winter on what the garden had given back in July. Every jar opened on a cold Sunday was a small reminder that the warm months had been good to them, and that a little planning in summer meant nobody had to wake up hungry when the ground outside was frozen hard. A single can of pink salmon was one of the cheapest things on the whole store shelf, and on Sunday it became something special. Grandmother flaked it into a bowl, bones and all, and mashed those soft little bones right in because they were good for you and nothing was ever wasted in that kitchen. She mixed in a beaten egg, a handful of cracker crumbs or some cold leftover cornbread, and a little chopped onion if there was one to spare. Then she shaped the whole thing into flat patties and fried them in a skillet until they were brown and crisp at the edges. The smell filled the kitchen and made the children come running in from the yard. One small can, stretched with crumbs and egg, made enough patties to go around the table with maybe one left over for whoever got to the plate first. It was humble food, but on a tight Sunday it felt like a real meal, and to a hungry family that mattered more than anything. When there was truly almost nothing in the house, a family could still make stewed tomatoes do the work of a whole supper. Grandmother opened a jar of her canned tomatoes, poured them into a pot, and stirred in a little sugar, a little salt, and a pat of whatever fat she happened to have. She let them cook down slow until they were soft and thick and bubbling. Then she tore up day-old bread, the heels and the dry slices that had been saved in a tin all week, and stirred those right into the pot until they soaked up the warm red juice and went tender. It was sweet and savory at the same time, and it stuck to your ribs through a long cold night. This was a dish born entirely out of not letting one single thing go to waste. The last tomatoes and the last bread brought together into one warm bowl. On a gray Sunday evening, it was the kind of food that made an empty kitchen feel a little less empty. Some of the very best Sunday food never cost a single penny, because it grew wild in the ditches and the fields. In early spring, before church or right after, the children were sent out with a sack to gather dandelion greens, poke, lamb's quarter, and whatever else the grown folks knew was safe to eat. Grandmother washed the dirt out of them carefully and put them on to boil with a little piece of fatback or a spoon of bacon grease to give them flavor. They cooked down to almost nothing, the way greens always do, dark and soft and silky in the pot. The broth they left behind was called pot liquor, and folks sopped it up with cornbread so that not a single drop went to waste. For families with empty pockets, these free greens were a true gift from the land itself. They knew which plants to pick because their own grandparents had taught them, passing down a kind of quiet knowledge that kept people alive through the very hungriest years. Liver was one of the cheapest cuts at the butcher shop, often sold for next to nothing, because the better cuts went home with people who had more money. So on a tight Sunday, that was what came home wrapped in white paper. Grandmother sliced it thin, dredged it in seasoned flour, and laid it gently into a hot skillet alongside a big pile of onions cut into rings. The onions cooked down slow and sweet, and that was the real secret of it, because they softened the strong taste of the liver and made the whole plate into something a child could learn to love. It filled the kitchen with a deep, rich smell that meant supper was close. Liver was full of iron and goodness, and the old folks knew without being told that it kept a body strong through a hard winter. What looked like the poorest cut of meat was really one of the most nourishing, and grandmother served it up proud, knowing she was feeding her family well on almost nothing at all. Before there was money for yeast or a real store-bought loaf, there were hoe cakes, and they fed poor families for generations. They were about the simplest thing in the world, just cornmeal, a little salt, and enough hot water or buttermilk to make a thick batter come together. Grandmother dropped spoonfuls onto a greased griddle and fried them flat and golden, crisp on the outside and soft within. The name came from the old days, when field hands cooked them right on the blade of a hoe over an open fire, because that was the only tool they had out there. On Sunday they came to the table stacked high, and you ate them with whatever was around, a smear of grease, a thin drizzle of syrup, or nothing at all. They cost almost nothing, and they filled the long hours between meals. For a family that had little, a stack of hot hoe cakes was proof that you could still make something good and warm out of nearly empty hands. On Sunday mornings up in the hill country, A jar of dark sorghum syrup sat right in the middle of the table, and that was the sweetest thing a lot of children ever knew. Sorghum was cheap because folks grew the cane themselves and pressed it down at the mill in the fall, cooking the juice for long hours into a thick, dark syrup that tasted like the whole harvest. There was no money for store-bought jam or honey, so this was the treat. Grandmother set out a plate of hot biscuits, and you poured a little syrup onto your plate, mixed in a pat of butter if you had it, and sopped it all up with the bread until your plate was clean and shining. It was simple, and it was plenty. That sticky sweetness was the small reward at the end of a hard week of work, a taste of pure comfort that cost the family only their own labor and the patience to wait for the cane to come in. When there was no fruit to be had and no money to go buy any, a family could still set a pie on the Sunday table, and they called these the desperation pies. The most surprising of all of them was vinegar pie. Grandmother whisked together sugar, a little flour, an egg, some water, and just enough vinegar to give it a bright, tangy bite that somehow tasted almost like lemon, even though there was not a lemon for miles around. She poured it into a crust and baked it until it set firm and golden on top. There was also the mock apple pie, made from plain soda crackers and a few warm spices when the apple barrel had run empty, and folks swore you could hardly tell the difference. These pies were made from the barest scraps left in the pantry, yet they let a poor family end their Sunday dinner with something sweet, the way they believed a proper Sunday was always meant to end. It was pride and love baked into a crust with almost nothing. For the very youngest and the very oldest at the table, and for anyone who was feeling poorly, there was milk toast, though some families gave it the gloomy old name of graveyard stew. It was about as simple as food ever gets. Grandmother toasted a slice of bread, set it down in a bowl, and poured warm milk over the top, sweetened with a little sugar and softened with a small pat of butter. That was the whole of it. The bread went soft and tender in the warm milk, easy to eat and gentle on a weak stomach. It cost almost nothing, just bread and milk, and yet on a cold Sunday night it felt like being wrapped up in a warm blanket. This was the food of comfort and quiet care, the thing a tired mother made for a sick child late at night. It carried no flavor of hardship in it at all, only the soft message that someone was looking after you, even when there was little else they could give. Out in the country, families who could keep a single hog made that one animal last all year long, and they used up every last part of it. After the killing in the cold months, nothing at all was thrown away. The scraps, the bits of meat still clinging to the bones, the parts no one wanted to look at, were all simmered down and seasoned and pressed together. Boiled up with cornmeal, it became scrapple, sliced thin and fried crisp for a Sunday breakfast. Set in its own jelly, it became souse, sliced cold and eaten on a piece of bread. Grandmother knew this was how poor people honored the gift of that hog, by wasting not one single scrap of it. What the wealthy might have thrown out, the poor turned into food that carried them through the lean months. There was a deep and quiet respect in the whole thing. The animal had given everything it had, and the family answered by letting nothing go to waste. Rice was cheap and it stretched a long way, so there was almost always a little left in the pot, and on Sunday that leftover rice became dessert. Grandmother scraped it into a baking dish, poured over milk and an egg or two, and stirred in sugar and a dusting of cinnamon and a handful of raisins if there happened to be any in the cupboard. Then she baked it slow until the top went golden, and the whole thing set soft and creamy through the middle. The smell of it baking on a Sunday afternoon was warm and sweet and full of promise. It turned plain, tired leftover rice, the kind of thing that might have been tossed out to the chickens, into a treat the children waited for all week long. This was the everyday magic of a poor kitchen, the way a careful hand could take what was left over and turn it into something that felt, for just one Sunday evening, almost like a small luxury. When the cold finally came and fresh food grew scarce, a family could still fill the whole table with a boiled dinner, and it cost very little to make. Grandmother put a chunk of salt pork or a cheap piece of corned meat into her biggest pot, and let it simmer for hours until it had gone soft. Then in went whatever the root cellar still held: the potatoes, the carrots, the turnips, and a whole head of cabbage cut into thick wedges. Everything cooked together in the same salty broth until it was tender and steaming. It made one single pot do the work of a whole meal, with nothing extra needed and nothing left behind but a good broth to be saved for later. The salt pork flavored everything it touched, so a small piece of meat could feed a large family. On a gray winter Sunday, that big steaming pot set in the middle of the table was the very picture of being cared for and full, made from the humblest things in the house. For a family that could rarely afford a real steak, a ring of bologna from the meat counter was a small Sunday celebration, and they called the fried slices poor man's steak. Grandmother cut it thick, a good half-inch, and made little slits all around the edges so it would not curl up and dance in the heat. Then she laid it in a hot skillet and fried it until both sides were brown, and the middle puffed up round like a little dome. The slices went onto soft white bread, maybe with a thin smear of mustard, and to a child it tasted every bit as fine as anything rich folks ate in town. It was cheap, it was filling, and on Sunday it felt like a true treat instead of a hardship. Sometimes the very simplest things become the warmest memories, and for many who grew up with little, the smell of bologna frying in a cast iron pan still carries them straight back to a Sunday at their grandmother's table. A box of dry macaroni cost only a few cents, and a jar of canned tomatoes was already sitting on the shelf. So together, they made a Sunday dish that filled the whole family up cheap. Grandmother boiled the macaroni soft, then poured it into a pot with her stewed tomatoes, a little sugar to cut the tang, a pat of fat, and plenty of salt and pepper. Sometimes she baked it in the oven until the top went a little crisp and brown. There was usually no meat in it at all, and there really did not need to be. It was warm and soft and filling, and it made a great big potful for almost no money. For families counting every single coin, this plain mix of noodles and tomatoes was a quiet kind of comfort. It is the sort of dish that never once appeared in a fancy cookbook, yet it fed millions of children through the hardest years and sent every one of them off to bed with a full stomach. Some of the leanest evenings ended with pancakes for supper, because flour and a little milk were almost always somewhere in the house, even when everything else had run out. Grandmother stirred up a simple batter, just flour, a pinch of salt, a spoon of grease, and enough milk or water to make it pour off the spoon. She ladled it onto the hot griddle and flipped each one over when the little bubbles came up across the top. Stacked high and eaten with a thin drizzle of syrup or just a sprinkle of sugar, they made a cheap and cheerful end to a hard day. Breakfast for supper was never once seen as strange in a poor home. It was seen as a real blessing, a way to fill hungry children with something warm and sweet when the meat and the vegetables had finally given out. To this very day, a plate of pancakes at dinner time can carry someone right back to those make-do Sunday nights. In the fall, when the apple trees gave more than the family could ever store away, Sunday often brought a skillet of fried apples to the table. Grandmother cored and sliced the apples, with the skins still left on, and laid them in a hot pan with a little fat and a spoonful of sugar and a good shake of cinnamon. She cooked them down slow until they were soft and brown and swimming in their own sweet syrup. The apples cost nothing, gathered from a tree out in the yard or traded over the fence with a neighbor who had more than they needed. Served warm beside a hot biscuit, they could be breakfast, supper, or dessert all at once. For a poor family, fresh fruit was a luxury on most days, so a skillet of fried apples on a Sunday was a true treat. It was the taste of the whole orchard in autumn, captured in a single pan, a small bit of sweetness saved up for the one slow day of the week. When the hens were laying well but the meat had run clean out, Sunday morning often meant creamed eggs on toast, a dish that turned a few plain eggs into a meal for everyone at the table. Grandmother Hard boiled the eggs, then made a simple white sauce from flour, grease, and milk, the very same kind of gravy she made for the biscuits. She sliced the eggs into it and let them warm through, then spooned the whole creamy mixture over slices of toasted bread. It was soft and rich, and it stretched a small handful of eggs all the way across a big table. The hens gave the eggs for free, so the only real cost was a little flour and a cup of milk. For a family that could never count on having meat, this was a way to put something hearty and warm in front of the children before they faced a long day of work or school. Simple as it was, it always felt generous, and that feeling was worth far more than the food itself. In the very hardest stretches, when the pantry was down to almost nothing, a family could still make a whole meal out of one onion, and many remember those onion suppers fondly even now. Grandmother sliced a sweet onion thin and laid it between two pieces of bread spread with a little butter or grease and a shake of salt, and that was the whole sandwich. On other nights, she browned the onions down in a pan and turned them into a gravy to pour over bread or a few boiled potatoes. An onion cost almost nothing and lasted a long time down in the cellar, so there was nearly always one on hand for a hungry night. It seems like so very little to set before a hungry family, yet those who lived through it remember the onion sandwich without a trace of shame. It was what got them through, and the love that handed it across the table was just as real as if the plate had been piled high with the finest meat in the whole county. For a great many children, the only sweet they ever really knew was the plain tea cake, and grandmother baked them on Sunday from the few simple things she always kept on hand. There was flour, a little sugar, an egg, a spoon of fat, and a splash of milk, and from those she made a soft dough and rolled it out on a floured board. She cut the cakes with the rim of a glass and baked them until the edges had just barely browned. They were not fancy, and they were not very sweet, more like a soft, plain cookie than anything you would find in a real bakery. But to a child who almost never tasted any sugar at all, a warm tea cake fresh from the oven was a little piece of heaven. They cost so little, yet they were made with such patient care that they became the thing the grandchildren remembered most of all. The smell of tea cakes baking on a quiet Sunday afternoon is, for so many people, the very smell of being loved. Nothing in a poor kitchen was ever thrown away, least of all the bread, so the dry heels and the stale slices were saved up all week in a tin, until there was finally enough for a Sunday bread pudding. Grandmother tore the old bread into pieces, poured over a custard of milk, eggs, sugar, and cinnamon, and let it soak until every last crumb had gone soft. She baked it slow until the top set golden and the whole kitchen filled up with a warm, sweet smell. A handful of raisins went in if there were any to be found, and a little syrup poured over the top made it finer still. What had started out as bread too dry to eat became the best dessert of the entire week. There was a quiet kind of wisdom in it, the way a careful grandmother could look down at a tin of wasted bread and somehow see a warm, sweet pudding waiting inside. Hardship taught these people to find plenty in the very things that others would have simply thrown away. And then there were the Sundays when no single family had to carry the whole table alone, because after the long morning service, everyone gathered together for what they called dinner on the ground. The women spread quilts and cloths across the long plank tables set up out in the churchyard, and each family brought along whatever little they had been able to spare. One brought a pot of beans, another a pan of cornbread, someone else a few fried chickens or a bowl of greens or a single precious pie. Set out all together in the open air, the poorest offering and the proudest one sat side by side, and somehow it became a feast that none of them could ever have made on their own. The children ran laughing between the tables, while the grown folks talked and rested in the cool of the shade. No one stood there counting who had brought the most. They only knew that by sharing the little each of them had, the whole community ate well, and for one long afternoon nobody there was poor. That was the deepest secret of all those hard years, the thing the food was really always for. It was never only about filling up a